I'll maybe kick us off. Uh, I found it a little bit uh, hilarious that after spending what I thought was a real chunk of time um, on trying to articulate why I feel very strongly that the protocol should be allowed to run its course. Uh, that some of the chatter in the Discord was that I want to market by Pinto with the remaining funds. So maybe would just use this opportunity to double down on what I think, which is that the the protocol, there was an open discussion: is the protocol dead? Is it not dead? Uh, where it's like, sure, short term, we're 8 million, delta B below peg, doesn't feel very bullish anytime soon. Um, and at 22 cents or whatever, there's great argument to be made for winding down the protocol entirely. But from where I sit, to do so would be greatly premature. That the arc of history is a long one, and we really don't know how all this is going to play itself out. And with that in mind, feel like it's much more prudent for us to allow the experiment to continue. And one of the reasons why I felt like the Pinto fork was far and away a better option in terms of how to move forward is that it actually allows for us to continue to see the existing experiment through, while also allowing us the freedom through restructuring the debt to see the model work again anew. And I think where there is the most merit to winding this down, even though I don't really see a great way to do it other than to market by Pinto, is the argument that I think Mad made or something, which is that you really can't support two of these protocols on the backs of the same community, or the back of the same community, and that really doesn't work. Um, this is something I'm open to being proven true, if you will. That it may be, in fact, that the only way to make this work is if there's really only one sheriff in town. Um, but that remains open to me. It's unclear to me if that's really true. It may be true at grand scale of hundreds of billions, but may not be true at small scale. And particularly given that right now there is an abundance of data that we still need. Like the model is truly far from optimal. From where I sit, um, it doesn't feel like the meta to wind down the old one. Um, like in particular, where it really rubs me the wrong way is, does that mean that every time now that we want to innovate and iterate on the model that we have to come to consensus about winding down the old one? Like that starts to feel like a permissioned innovation setting, where now it's like, well, do we really think this change is important enough to warrant winding down the whole previous system? uh and you may say that's a little extreme. You're just we're shutting down the current one because it's not working. And to that I would say, like, maybe, but maybe it is working. It's just not working nearly as much as we would like it to work right now. But in the grand scheme of things, it still has tremendous potential to work. Um, so all of this is to say, I acknowledge right now the current Beanstalk is absolutely in the shitter. Um, but even with that being the case, I still feel like the wrong decision would be to just kill it. Um, that just doesn't feel right to me from the perspective of experimenting. From the perspective of just trying to make money, probably does make more sense to market bid Pinto. Feel like that is, particularly in the short term, more likely to yield return for Beanstalk holders. So at the same time, I feel quite comfortable in my position of right now, system's not doing almost anything, and we're better off leaving it than we are killing it. So that was something that I think might have been misinterpreted, or maybe I didn't properly express myself last time. So wanted to just kick us off with a brief statement on that stuff. All right, I see we've got like a dozen people here. Um, what's on people's minds? Questions, comments, complaints, concerns.
I don't have a particular question or comment, but maybe to just offer an additional perspective, given that, you did most or all of the talking last time and didn't have a chance to hear from other people who had worked on Beanstalk previously. But I feel like I agree and appreciate your perspective, Ben, that in some, definition of the word dead, Beanstalk is not that. It felt like, in listening to the call last week, um, that what people were really getting at is if there's any, short term future for the project, which I think, sort of it sounds like we're on the same page that there isn't much of that. And yeah, I can totally appreciate, people's frustration last week that, the idea if Pinto is to grow significantly, someone may be interested in, buying up the bean price one day. May not be a very satisfying answer. Um, and yeah, I feel like in an ideal world, there would be some way, even before that time, to, you know, either close it down or redistribute funds or something to that effect. Uh, similar to what Ben presented last week, it's very unclear to me how you would go about doing that, given that it would require stockholders voting against their own interests in some capacity. So I remain unsure how to proceed on that front.
But are you suggesting that if there was something, that seemed aligned, that you would support winding it down?
Yeah, I think so. I agree from an idealist perspective, it doesn't really support the world you're referring to, where it's, you know, again, ideally nice to see them both run, to see what would happen if Pinto were to get significant adoption, how that would affect Beanstalk. But yeah, it does feel like there's some, cost. And I think, Ben acknowledged, which I agree with, feel like it was definitely the wrong decision that the Pinto crew made, myself included, to not announce Pinto's existence to the Beanstalk community in the beginning. Um, and it feels like in some sense, closing down Beanstalk would be the right thing to do. I can't say that I have the most, rigorous arguments to back up uh, that position. Um, But again, it just from a practical perspective, had really no clue how you would go about doing it.
I don't foresee a scenario where we can really turn it off. Um, it feels like, the only ethical thing to do with the FERT contributions, if we're really not going to continue with the experiment, is to return either all or the vast majority of funds to the original FERT contributors, or maybe I guess the current FERT holders. Um, but I can't foresee a circumstance where the stockholders that get to vote would be incentivized to do that. So I just don't see that happening.
And even if they were in some capacity, it's like there's still liquid bean holders, et cetera, or unripe holders that, in anticipation of seeing some sort of proposal like this succeed, like why would they not take all value that they're able to? Like there would have to be some sort of freeze in advance. Um, yeah, it's not so simple.
Yeah, I mean, part of me feels attracted to that position. Oh, if only we could wind it down, then surely we would all agree to wind it down. But uh, the idealist in me politely, uh, maybe not so politely, refuses. It just doesn't feel right to me. But I do appreciate your perspective very much, Austin. What else, folks? What's up, Thirsty Whale? Long time no see. Amazing you've been so thirsty for so long.
And if you made a bunch of money on Pinto, would you yourself consider repegging Beanstalk?
Depends what you mean by a bunch, but you better believe it. I mean, hard to think of anything more like positive EV for my bags than that. I mean, yeah, it would have to be a lot of money given we're 8 million below peg, and I'd expect on the way up to peg there would be a lot of people wanting to sell. And even after peg, I'd expect a lot of people wanting to sell. And I don't know how quickly it's reasonable to expect there to be like a big pump, even after repegging. So from that perspective, I think it might be, it might be you'd need a lot of money. But from where I sit, absolutely, that makes a ton of sense.
And I'm curious for any even Beanstalk upgrade, over the last year, uh, whether it was like the gauge system or otherwise, if you had felt at the time that those were going to be a high enough leverage to either repeg the price, result in some sort of growth over some period of time, or, and if so, that, obviously, like if those were anyone's expectations, like they weren't met. Curious where you stood on that spectrum.
The truth is, it's a little hard to put myself back in that headspace and say exactly what I was thinking. But what I can say is, I think well, first, we really have experienced extended periods of time. I recognize this is the longest one. And at this point, the bean price is also at like an all-time low. So from many different perspectives, the system is now at its all-time least healthy. But less than a year ago, the system had a printing cycle. And so I think we often forget how how on the one hand how close the system has been even over the past year towards being healthy, and now sort of how far it is. And with that in mind, I look at the upgrades like the gauge system as major improvements to the overall efficacy of the model, but not necessarily particularly the way the gauge system was parameterized, like with a maximum crop ratio of 100%, to really be a strong repegging factor, or something that we would expect to have dramatic effects. I think what we're seeing with Pinto is really interesting, where we felt the need to change the crop ratio. Maybe not a need, but have felt that it's the right thing to do to change the crop ratio from the max crop ratio from 100% to 150%, such that now Pinto as a system will be incentivizing quite heavily holding deposited Pinto in the silo over deposited LP tokens. And the way the gauge system was parameterized in Beanstalk of having a max crop ratio of 100% really makes it such that that's not the case in Beanstalk. That at all points in time, Beanstalk is really prioritizing holding LP over holding beans. And we've observed in both systems quite a strong preference from users in terms of holding LP over holding raw beans or raw Pinto in the silo. And the fact that the crop ratio was set at 100%, I think that's something that we can look back on and say, like, that was highly unlikely to ever really be in a position to repeg the system. So I think if we look at the efficacy of the seed gauge it's one thing to look at like how is the distribution of LP tokens. That's something that played out really with Pinto a lot more than with Beanstalk. But in terms of how did we affect that? How did we think that upgrade was going to affect peg maintenance? I can't say that at least from where I sat, there was an expectation that that was going to magically repeg the system. At the same time, has it been a little disappointing to see how little effect it's had on peg maintenance? Definitely. But I think it generally can be quite reasonably chalked up to the crop ratio was set very conservatively. And the result is that we haven't had a strong incentive to convert from beans to LP.
It appears there's only 48K of liquid, non-unripe, non-bean token in the silo. So that's only, not nearly enough to convert power to repeg it. And so unless you implemented something like negative stock for unripe LP, then I don't think that any kind of crop ratio modifications are going to be enough to repeg the system.
Well, why is that? The system can always repeg.
It can repeg,
Can you
but
tell me
we're talking
again
about
why?
actual incentives to make that happen.
Well, I think what I'm hearing
Pizza
from
Man's-
Pizza Man is that there's literally not any LP tokens to convert the value of, right?
That aren't unripe.
That aren't unripe, yeah.
And the unripe
Yes.
already has no seeds, right?
Correct.
And so the seed gauge wouldn't really affect the incentive to convert unripe at all.
Yeah. As with everything as is, yes.
So I think your analysis is generally correct, Pizza Man.
I mean, there's no reason that negative seeds couldn't have some sort of impact on that in theory. Although I'd probably say, there's so few eyes on the system at the moment, or people paying attention, that it's unclear what effect that would have.
Have any ideas been discussed around like a forced chop for all of unripe?
A forced chop?
Yeah.
That just sounds ugly. Eee. You're gonna force me to chop? I thought we had freedom.
No. Like, give you 6 months notice to chop before forced chop, for example, and then after that, forced chop.
Well, what's the difference?
The difference is that 98% of the participants are inactive, and therefore, with 6 months notice, I think it's reasonable, and they could be forced chopped after that point. At which point you
If
have.
you let me chop, or you force me to chop, what's the difference? I choose to chop ahead of you chopping me. How is that any different than a forced chop?
Maybe swap them with beans, but I guess the idea is that they're not participating in any. Maybe they are. They don't want to. So.
Like
I'm
the
not
idea
understanding.
I think the maybe at least one way I think of it is that the current unripe holders, whether they exist or not, they have a claim or control on the liquidity that's right now locked in the silo. And if we just think of 10% of them actually lost their keys or whatever, then that 10% that's in the silo right now is just not, it's just sitting not controlled at all. It's ideal. Maybe one way to do it is to give everyone a claim, and if you come and claim it, you get it, but we don't just lock some liquidity for forever.
I'm curious, hearing Pizza Man, what it is that you're actually suggesting. I don't understand what you mean by a forced chop.
So basically, the protocol is dead as long as all of the unripe holders are totally inactive, right? But the unripe holders alone could repeg the system. additionally, the unripe holders hold so much stock that there is zero incentive to enter the silo because people who actually have no stake, are holding all the control of the stock. Additionally, I would make the argument that the unripe holders, I should note that I am one as well, basically were airdropped these unripe tokens, and they did not, post-exploit, they did not put any new capital into the system to get them. And so they also have no incentive to, like someone mentioned before, I wish they would have joined this call as well, that at this point, they've basically written it off, but just in case it comes back someday, they're willing to basically stick it out and see if maybe the system comes back. But in general, the system needs to reach a low point and have all the liquidity that wants to exit before the system can start to return and repeg. And so somehow encouraging that so-called dead liquidity to exit brings us closer to a future repegging.
Sure, I still don't understand what you mean by a forced chop, though.
Oh yeah, so
Like, are you proposing chopping and doing something? Because if everyone chops, like the amount of stock doesn't necessarily change, the price doesn't necessarily change. So are you assuming some other action as part of that?
And if we force chop everyone, then what does it even mean to chop? Like,
no,
what do we
I
do?
would say more of more of like an opt-out system. So I would say everyone will be chopped in 6 months unless you opt out and you don't want to be chopped, for example, or even a year. Like I don't think that there's any sense of urgency in this community. So call it a year, for example, and say after a year, if obviously the stockholders need to vote to pass this as well, because nothing can be done without the stockholders due to the governance system. But that gives the system a chance that all that dead liquidity can exit. In addition, when you chop, you lose your stock too. Although I guess not with convert chop, which is not what I was taking into account. So yeah, I guess that they would retain their stock, except they would only have like a super small portion of liquidity under backing this proportionally relatively large amount of stock. So perhaps convert chopping everyone's not ideal, but just doing like a regular chop for them. And then all those people that want to exit or that are inactive as well, their chopped beans could be swapped for ripe liquidity, so they actually get something out of it. And then, unless they opt out, of course, then from there, now you suddenly have, the system is freed up. It's cleared up a massive amount of debt by removing the unripe obligation, and it gives some hope that it can be moved forward, and the FERT holders and the rest of the system can continue to work as it was supposed to.
I mean, in practice, all this would do is marginally decrease the amount of unripe stuff out there. I think, right? Like some people wouldn't be paying attention, and they would lose their claim.
You think only a small percent of people are not paying attention? I would say it's quite a large percent are not paying attention.
And therefore, they should have all their money confiscated. Like, for me, one of the principles of a system like this is that, my money's my money, and you really can't take it away from me. So I think doing something like this would greatly jeopardize the censorship resistance of the protocol.
Well, one counter to that is that the value of my or our money has more or less gone to zero. So in a way, it's kind of already been taken away. What I think maybe one interesting frame on this is, what if Beanstalk were to sort of take ownership of version of unripe. So, for example, unripe holders might be able to keep their tokens, but the protocol is actually converting on behalf of them based on the current position of peg. This sort of gets at what I think Pizza Man is saying around there's some latent liquidity that's not converting. Sort of an extension of the unripe framework would be to say, hey, if you want to keep your unripe tokens, no problem. But in order to help the protocol get out of this mess, it actually has the right to choose when to convert those tokens. Of course, how you decide that is a separate question, but something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more interested in some auto convert feature versus confiscating value from people. Um, I think the problem with the auto convert feature has always been one, front running, like a sandwich of the convert, and two, it generally does seem pretty risky, for the protocol at this point to try to repeg itself so aggressively. But at the same time, I see a lot of benefit in such a thing. Um, in the protocol basically saying, hey, there's no money coming in or out. Therefore, it doesn't really feel like there's a strong reason to, not be making progress towards peg via converts. And if the protocol is unable to incentivize converts, because the main way that it incentivizes converts is with seeds and the unripe assets, which are the controllers of the vast, vast, vast majority of value in the system, don't have any seeds, such that there's no way for the system to really incentivize converts, then I could see that. I could see that making sense. Um, I think maybe one better than auto converting is some sort of convert bonus, which is something that's been talked about in the context of Pinto quite a bit. And I'd be interested to see if, before moving to some auto convert architecture or system, maybe putting in a convert bonus first, and just seeing if just through creating bonuses, there's enough people that are still in the system and actively participating that we could find some way to incentivize them to participate. Um, but otherwise, I think there's a lot of merit to some sort of auto convert. I don't see why not.
I think the thing that's important about the auto convert, which Pizza Man is pointing out, is, and it really comes down to who's paying attention. And I think it's somebody else here would probably have much better data on this, but it seems like a significant portion of that remaining liquidity has just not paid any attention at all. Maybe it's funds left over from the 2021 cycle. Who knows? But it seems like even bonus incentives don't really move the needle when people aren't listening. And frankly, I think the perspective is probably that if you already think your money isn't worth anything anymore, then like a bonus thing doesn't really move the needle. But yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea that a bonus could be worth trying.
Yeah, I agree that at this point in the state of Beanstalk, I don't think a convert up bonus would have much efficacy.
Yeah, hard to disagree
Or
with that.
any.
I guess that's just for me, it does feel risky to just move to this auto convert thing. Um, Now, I guess if the premise is the thing is dead anyways, who cares? But again, this goes back to the fact I don't really subscribe to that. Um, but it's like, if we're converting, it does sort of create a really weird game. There's $4 million of exogenous value still in the protocol. It doesn't feel like, um, from here to peg, my guess is we're going to have quite a decent amount of chops and outflows. And I can imagine the L2SR collapsing even further. But maybe that's okay. Like maybe the meta is just to sort of bleed all the way to close to zero liquidity, but also sort of bleed out all of the unripes and get everyone who's still here and paying attention to chop and get out at some price. And then at that point, they'll be able to, the system will be finally healthy enough to actually repeg, if that makes sense.
I think
So,
something with that as well. You do it, you complement it with a new pod line, and then because you will still expect that there will be, once you peg, you're going to start like minting, giving whatever liquidity you still have left, and a new pod line, takes a claim on that. So that will make the field attractive again.
geez, new pod line? That sounds so intense.
I mean, if you're repegging and you're minting again, I don't think it makes sense to pay the old pod line.
Well, you mean pay the interest rates of the old pod line?
Or just pay them. Like if we just got back to peg, system is back again, you definitely want to start incentivizing new credit or the claim on those new mints.
Are you suggesting defaulting on the old debt or just starting a new pod line as well?
Yeah, I think a new pod line that sits on front of the old one. So sure, if no one ever wants to,
Oh my goodness.
yeah, if no one wants to, if there is no, like the new pod line is, there is no debt to be paid, and we're still minting, then pay off the old pod line.
Personally, I think that's kind of crazy, but at that point, it's like, why not just restart? And it's like, that's what Pinto is. Pinto is restart. Like, to me, the only real purpose in continuing with the Beanstalk experiment is to see what'll happen if we're able to pay off this debt. The protocol has like $1 billion of debt. Something crazy. Like, what does it mean? What would it mean for the protocol to actually pay that off? So the idea of like, now changing the terms of repayment so significantly that, I feel like it would already be a pretty significant change in the terms of the payment to add a new pod line that gets 25% of mints, right? If we did 25% to the silo, 25% to the barn, and then 50% to the field, half and half to the old pod line, new pod line, I feel like that's already a pretty big restructuring on the pod line versus to put a new pod line in front of the old pod line is sort of like an egregious from a like if I'm a lender, that's the type of treatment that I would view as pretty egregious and make it such that I would never want to lend to the system again. Whereas, making it so that I receive, instead of a 33% cut of mints, I receive a 25% of mint, I think that's more stomachable and less likely to disrupt the overall value of the protocol, which as a credit-based system, so much of the value of the protocol is just in the debt itself. So I think we have to be really careful about doing something like that.
Well, a couple of thoughts there. First of all, I think that, my view, the lendability of Beanstalk, the ability or the interest of people to lend to Beanstalk is right now as low as it will ever go, right? And so any form of restructuring that ends up being unsuccessful, you're in the same place. Any form of restructuring that ends up being successful, I think you're strictly better off. There's probably some counter arguments to that, but in my view, this is as bad as it can possibly be. So I'm like sympathetic to the idea of looking at forms of restructuring or adjustment that would potentially allow us to have any shot at all. I think it seems like we have basically zero shot at this point. That said, I think another way to think about you're talking, Ben, about the concept of Beanstalk as an experiment and sort of seeing Beanstalk as it stands currently. The experiment, if you will, is how can we dig out of this hole, and what happens if you're able to dig out of the hole after that. I think one perspective that I think you bring is seeing Beanstalk the protocol as sort of its own entity, if you will, that rather than maybe thinking about the participants in Beanstalk in that context. And what I'd say is like another way to think about the experiment is what are participants willing to do or to change about their position in order to like I guess in one perspective cash out or at least have some shot at maintaining some value, but two, also what are they willing to do in order to keep the whole protocol moving. And so there may be more learnings there than there are in just letting it sit for a while and more or less have nothing happen at all.
I appreciate that perspective very much. I mean, I would just say that the the current meta being run is to move, but to move via forking. And from where I sit, there is real cost in doing things as radical as a new pod line or as radical as auto converting back to peg. Um, these are things that I think sure may increase and almost certainly increase the likelihood that people get paid back. Um,
What's
I
radical
don't
about
want
it
to.
if people vote for it?
Well, what was your question? What's radical about it? What?
If stockholders, for example, vote for it.
Well, I mean, one, there's a question of would they vote for it.
Sure.
But
Putting that to
I
the side.
sure. For me, I do feel pretty strongly that this this is an experiment first and foremost. And I would put Beanstalk and Pinto under the same experiment, which is can we create incentives out of, you know, basically thin air where we're creating a new game where just through the rules of the game are we able to create incentives where people individually following those incentives are able to coordinate to some other goal that isn't really possible to incentivize directly. Um, and it's a tremendous problem. It's a fascinating problem. It's a grand experiment. But given the experimental nature of the task, for me, there is a whole lot of value in getting clean data. That from where I sit, the way that we're going to maximize the chances of us succeeding in the grand scheme of things is by having really pure data. And I do view the original Beanstalk as one of the best possible, even in theory, sources of the data. And as soon as we start making changes like an auto convert or like a new pod line, wall that will get us new data, um, which I don't want to diminish. And it will almost certainly increase the likelihood that the participants in the system get paid back, which I also definitely don't want to diminish. I recognize like people put their hard earned money into this thing and people really want to get a return. Um, I understand that. At the same time, I think it's really important that we recognize the value of the data even today that we're getting from Beanstalk. And I think we could get a whole lot more data if we continue to treat the protocol as alive, even if it's sort of dead. And once we decide, yeah, this thing is dead, and therefore the types of risk that we're willing to take on with the changes that we make is magnitude or orders of magnitude higher than it was previously, I expect that the quality of the data, in particular with respect to trying to uh, win this experiment, to find a solution to the problem, I question whether doing so will help us achieve our ends.
Yeah, I can see that to some extent. I'd push back in a couple of ways. So one, I think from what I remember, the one of the reasons for you know looking at a fork was, in fact, maybe the primary reason was that we aren't gathering data on Beanstalk because functionally nothing was happening, right? And so I think, to me, to hear that like we're still gathering data feels like uh, it feels incongruent with maybe, I think, the narrative around the time of that pivot. And I would be curious, materially what data we're gathering here. So that's one thing we should discuss. I think a second thing is, I'm again sympathetic to the idea that you're learning something here. Maybe you're like, this is the biggest possible challenge an algorithmic protocol of this form could have, and let's see if we can dig our way out. That said, I think one, in the broader scheme of the experiment, right? You now have two parallel tracks running, and frankly, most of the investment, both monetarily and otherwise, has moved to Pinto, right? And so Pinto now sort of has stepped into the position of being that data gathering apparatus, if you will. On the Beanstalk front, it feels a little bit, I think we may be in that realm now where there's some harder trade-offs to think through, that extend, beyond just data piece, right? Like we can continue to sort of gather gather data, if you will, on the backs of a bunch of initial contributors. But I think that we may need to at some point say, hey, all right, we've gathered enough data. This thing is kind of fucked. Let's look at what ways we can try to fix this, which might create a sort of step function in terms of after you implement something like automatic convert, and maybe you say, all right, well, we can only draw so many conclusions about the Beanstalk experiment now for other things. But certainly, I think there would be, a number of interesting, relevant learnings, at a minimum for Beanstalk itself, and very likely for both protocols as you think about sort of the potential futures that Pinto might have. And then I think secondarily, if you imagine, if you play out uh, a successful story in the Beanstalk context, I think, uh, in my view, the sentiment and potential for capital inflows to Pinto as well actually goes up pretty significantly, because I think most people, at least that I've encountered, seem to know that uh, Pinto is kind of this extension of Beanstalk, and at least in some ways see them as continuous. So I'm not saying that'll necessarily prevent Pinto's growth, but I certainly think that it wouldn't hurt to have to have a happy ending in some ways on the Beanstalk front.
Well, who doesn't want a happy ending? You know, I think to clarify the. Go ahead.
I say to drive it to a question, I would say, if Beanstalk we shouldn't implement these changes or consider changes, for example, because it would impact data. I think the question is like materially what data is being gathered and on what timeline and what conclusions can be drawn.
Sure. Well, yeah, I feel like language here can be, is very important. The absence of data that was felt that Pinto was a response to is that there's all these upgrades to the protocol a la seed gauge that were not really being uh, experimented with because no one was using the system. And so from that perspective, there was an absence of data because no one was using these new mechanisms. And there wasn't an opportunity to see how the mechanisms could be further improved. And so that led to a stagnation in the pace of development of the protocol itself. Maybe the wrong thing to say was that we're gathering data about Beanstalk much now. Because to your point, like there's nothing happening. Like what data could you possibly be collecting right? Maybe a better way to present it is there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity that basically, if we ever are able to fix the system and repeg it and it works again, that the more changes that are made to the core of the system itself to create that repegging or that healing. I feel it's very important that the changes that are made are in line with the idea that the protocol has integrity. And so something like an auto convert, like I guess it's okay. Because we're not really even seeing how the seed gauge works right now. This is just the system seems to be at an equilibrium that is not healthy and not going anywhere. And therefore, we're going to introduce a change that is meant to, in a somewhat artificial way, repeg it. And that's okay. Like, sure, it is okay. Um, um, I feel similarly about a new pod line. Like we want to say no more pods at the end of the pod line. New pod line, 25% of seniorage going to it, and temp starts at 0. Let's see how quickly we can create enough demand to repeg the system. All possible. Where I get concerned is with these changes. How much are we compromising the benefit? Like in the end, let's say that Beanstalk is able to repeg and is able to go through a major growth cycle and pay off a lot of its debt. Like, to what end? You know, is it just that it works for a short period of time and then nothing has changed fundamentally? And to me, this is a behavioral system, a community-based system. So the only way that we're going to be able to get to a point where Beanstalk is sustainable again is if the changes that are made in order to try to save the system are still in line with the values of the system itself. So yeah, I think maybe the idea of presenting like right now we're getting data is probably not the right way to present how I'm thinking about it. To me, it's more like insofar as we're going to try anything, even if it's a little desperate. But if we're going to try anything, what we're trying should be very aligned with the core value proposition of the protocol.
Just wanted to chime in and say I generally agree with everything Silo Chat is saying, and in particular, wanted to mention that with respect to getting clean data, I think I don't need to make a defeatist argument in any sense, and it is a spectrum, but feel like that ship sailed to some extent. Hey, Cook Pinto, I'm gonna server mute you, but if you want to speak up, just leave a message in the barnyard chat. Feel like
And
that
like
ship
they were getting
sailed.
ripped. Pinto is jacked.
I feel like to some extent that ship sailed with the exploit in the sense that no one sitting on work, sitting around a circle coming up with ideas about how to improve Beanstalk or Pinto is going to come up with the idea that we should have fertilizer in a vacuum or we should have unripe assets, in a vacuum. Feels like those things were, obviously and very understood to be, headwinds to the system that only existed as a result of the exploit. And I agree that, in some sense, making further changes that sort of step, each time step a little bit further away from, the core value proposition, jeopardize, the information and feedback you get from watching the system work. But resonate strongly with Silochad's point that at this point, think that it is as far away as it could ever be uh, from, however you want to frame it, repegging, attracting more creditors, etc., such that doing anything in pursuit of reversing that trend uh, would get us much more data than we would otherwise. And the other thing is, I don't know how much data we would get from the idea that, not to pick on you, Ben, but since that you have spoken
You can
up
pick on
as an
me.
advocate,
You can pick up on me. Go ahead.
and you in particular have spoken up as an advocate for, hey, if Pinto is to be very successful one day, maybe one day you feel inspired to buy a bunch of beans. I think that's great, but I'd be interested to hear if anyone else feels similarly. In terms of what they would do with their money in theory one day in the future. But I don't know how much data we can gather from that. The idea that one of the people who created this system feels inspired to come back and save it one day in the theoretical future. So those are a few thoughts.
I mean, I feel like a fork system future is going to come to Beanstalk and Beanstalk-like protocols. And so using Beanstalk as an example of what could be achieved through a fork system, would give us a lot of data in terms of understanding, how the market reacts and what a fork system is capable of, and the tools that stockholders have at their disposal to use in order to potentially change and restructure the protocol. I think there's a lot of value in that. But at the same time, like keeping Beanstalk and leaving it as, an original experiment that is not, you know, that is not ever going to restructure anything, and just seeing how that plays out over a very long period of time is also something very valuable, as it, will always be the original. But, it's already somewhat, had to substantially change things in order to deal with the exploit, and it suffered with the exploit. And that caused it to lose some level of purity, if you will. And, totally see an argument for why, making it further impure might be valid for the sake of data. I mean, I feel like the barn race was a massive learning experience and experimenting with different tools that system participants have in order to, deal with situations like an exploit, and, situations where it felt like just restarting the protocol would leave it in an unhealthy state. So, yeah, I think from my end, there's a strong argument for both. But, there is massive value in looking at how a restructured future could look like in the form of some sort of fork.
Yeah, I think in my view, the fork, the fork system is valuable, but like separate from the decision of should Beanstalk make a material change, right? It's kind of like one of the presuppositions of the fork system is that every protocol is like independently choosing what it is going to do with itself, right? And I think one way of thinking about that, and perhaps the way that you guys have swam of late, is like every protocol is immutable, and you only fork to move. When you fork, you're basically that's your one-step function to something new. But given that Beanstalk is not immutable, I guess Pinto's not either. But you get that, you get the concept. like that's already like it's already possible for and perhaps baked into Beanstalk that the rules can be updated over time, right? And in a way that might be part of, I guess the way that I see that with respect to Beanstalk is that's one form of resilience, right? Like I think there's a perspective in crypto at large that that we're going to try to design a system that works from day zero and you never touch it again, and it's just like the design is so perfect that it is completely anti-fragile to all things. And maybe there's some context in which that's true and where that works out, but I think certainly for protocols as sort of experimental as Beanstalk, I'm not sure that it's possible, at least with our feeble human minds and limited time and data to have an exhaustive an exhaustive view of what will work and what won't. And that, to your point, like insofar as something is an experiment, I think you want to be able to update your parameters and run another test, or add a little bit more of this chemical or that chemical. And so that's kind of the way that I think where we how we should move forward from here.
Are you suggesting in the form of a fork system or through an upgrade?
Specifically with respect to Beanstalk, I'm suggesting upgrades. I'm saying that upgrades and fork system are like two separate things, right? And I think like if, in principle, the way the Beanstalk community and development, contributors, etc., want to swim is like, hey, we're going to try to design the core functions of this protocol so we can like, pick up, ship out, and start something new separately. And that fork is like, that forking mechanism is part of the structure. That's a design decision that certainly like sympathetic to. But with respect to the current situation for Beanstalk right now, as it stands, I think uh, what I'm suggesting is like looking more seriously at um, proposed adjustments to the protocol itself, whether that's like, I guess, like restructuring or haircuts or however you want to describe it, and actually moving forward with those to get something out of what we have now. And I guess my like final argument is I think if what you want is data, you probably learn a lot more from that than from doing nothing. I think my assumption is if we do nothing, we learn nothing and we get nothing. So
Well, I don't know if I agree with the binary. Like, we're already getting a lot of data through Pinto. So to me,
in the Beanstalk context, sorry. I'm sure
sure, but
Pinto will
it's
be
it's
interesting.
all one context for me. Like the thing about Beanstalk is right now, if you sort of cross the Rubicon and excuse me, if you cross the Rubicon and start to make changes that really dramatically change the model, excuse me, and a lot of the core value, like, and the theory behind the model, you may repeg it, great, but the cost of doing it in that fashion is that I think you may compromise the value created almost entirely. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is through the creation of these incentives, create value and create a currency that can hold that value. And I have a fear that if we just take the most direct approach to creating the value, that the value itself may not last, that it may be quite short lived, and that the integrity of the value will be compromised. So, to me, I still see there being tremendous potential. Because again, all of this is behavioral and it's community based. Like, if we're able to do it, we get both right. Like, both honor the system and create value in a way that has integrity. Like, I see preserving the original Beanstalk such that this can be a story like that makes sense. I think it has one of the potential to be one of the best stories in human history, and it through the power of that story, be something that has persistent value across space and time, and the credit of the system can actually be game changing for real. Whereas, you introduce something kind of funky like an auto convert that's a temporary fix. Um, I wonder what that gets you. And you add a new pod line, which I think would be tremendously bullish for the system. Like, I wonder what that gets you in the long term if now there's the potential to just, when the going gets tough, just make a new pod line. And maybe that's okay. Like, maybe that's acceptable to pod holders that or to lenders, prospective lenders, that the chance that there might be a new pod line at some point is a fear, but it's okay because it actually increases the EV of my getting paid back in the first place. Like, that's a totally valid theory. For me, it's just about the cost of really changing the model so significantly. I think it's worth saying it is a crossing of the Rubicon. Once we do it, we do lose something forever. Um, so for me, that's where the hesitance comes from.
But what is the path for this, like, happy ending? The only path right now is for either ETH to go to, like, 50,000 or 10,000, or, as the other source said, someone comes and saves it. But I think we're just like leaving it now with
Pindo just goes to 1 billion. Like, to me, that's already pretty good. Now you could say, like, well, if Pindo goes to 1 billion and saves Beanstalk, great. Then why do we even need to keep the OG Beanstalk around in the first place? Why not just experiment with it heavily? And I think there's a lot of validity in that perspective. I mean, another fear I have is, if we're really going to get experimental with this thing, not that we're not already deeply experimental, but further out there on the spectrum of experiments and of the boldness of each leg of the experiment to do something like an auto convert. I have fear that the people in the community that are already angry that things have not worked out will be even angrier, and in many ways be more justified. Like, how dare you take such a rash strategy to try to fix this thing? For me, there's a hesitancy of being so risky with our strategy, given the lack of widespread support, or even not support, but acknowledgement of the experimental nature of the thing. Uh, that makes it, to me, less attractive to, sort of throw shit at the wall. People are already very unhappy, despite our historically, like, really rigorous approach to all this. So it's like, now we're gonna take on more risk, and we're gonna do things that are even riskier. Like, I, for me, it's hard to know how we could even go about getting sufficient buy-in from the participants in the system that would be an acceptable action to take. And I get it; you can't make everyone happy, and we shouldn't let a few sour grapes prevent us from acting wisely. Certainly not. But I question the integrity of such actions, given how uh, you know how widespread the unhappiness has been.
Sure. I think you can imagine at least, following through with a proposal to the extent that you could figure out if that was actually a blocker, right?
Repeat.
That's a very, it's a very real potential problem, but it's not a problem yet.
That is true. All right. I feel like there's a lot of food for thought here. I'm I don't know if anyone has anything else they want to add here. We've already been at it for like 75 minutes. But I think the intention is to have these Beanstalk calls more regularly. So there should be an opportunity for us to resume a conversation after sitting in it for a little while, within the next week or so.
Yeah, Ben, there's
I
a
mean-
question in the chat from Classic.
Hold on, let me go try to find it.
Like, I think food for thought is trying to figure out, what like restructures people would be willing to consider, and what is the power that, what kind of tools can we have if people really think we should try to make things, to change things in order to have a meaningful impact on the system.
What was your question, Brendan? I missed that.
It wasn't a question. It was just, that's something to think about as ways we could restructure the system.
I see Classic is asking about. They say there are still trades here and there through the system. Is it possible to add a trade fee within there? A simple way to burn 0.1% of the bean side of the bean traded every time there's a trade. Short answer is yes. This is possible. It would be a significant amount of work architecting the pool, the AMM function in the pool, migrating the liquidity over. Definitely possible. Given the amount of volume we're seeing in the system, hard to imagine any sort of fee that would be reasonable would have any effect on the overall health of the system. But it is possible. And I think there is a movement in the Pinto community to implement a fee on the trades. So maybe at that point in time, it will be less overhead to copy the change over to Beanstalk. But see it as a not such a low hanging fruit and with very limited benefits in practice.
Yeah, I got a question.
Mm.
John here. So I haven't really been keeping up with a lot of stuff, so I just wanted to know, are you guys gonna be releasing like some sort of white paper or something that kind of explains what's been going on for the people who are out of the loop? Because I'm sure if you just look through Discord, a lot of comments are being thrown around, and I don't know if other people are keeping as close an eye as I am, or as not close as I am. So just seeing, is there some documentation or something out there?
It's a great question and a great point, John. I don't know exactly what the plan is, honestly. We're just now starting to come back and talk with the community on a regular basis. Definitely see there being some benefit in creating a document to sort of explain to people what's going on for those that have been tuned out. Don't think it would be a white paper per se, but could definitely see the value of a document like that.
It doesn't, yeah, I didn't mean necessarily a white paper, just something almost like, hey, we've been gone for X amount of time. This is or you've been gone since X amount of time. This is what you missed type thing. Because I'm hearing you guys talk about another coin now, and I have no idea what is what anymore. So
Great. This is great feedback. Thank you.
yeah.
Maybe John doesn't know about Pinto.
What's up?
Do you know about Pinto?
Nope. And that's also like part of the reason why I'm mentioning maybe there's some value there to actually explain to people what Pinto is or what's going on with Bean. Because if you just read through the server, pretty doomer outcast or something. It looks.
Yeah,
it
what's
looks
up with
great.
all these doomers, John? Did
What?
you let them
I
in the
don't know.
Discord?
It's your server, not mine. You tell me.
Thank you very much, John. This is a great input. Yeah, I think that's the new Tame Impala album that just got announced. Doomerism. All right. Anything else anyone wants to add before we hop? Great. All right. Thank you everyone for the time. We'll be back soon.